Hello students, this is a video guide for Fahrenheit 451 Alternative Task 1, which will look at the theme Individuality versus Conformity. Please have the Word document available as we work through these questions, whereby I will provide some hints and tips as to what techniques to look for and how to consider the context to help answer the questions. To begin with, you're asked to read the extracts that are provided and consider what do these have to do with individuality versus conformity as a theme. The intention is for you to respond to all the set questions using complete sentences and show your understanding of TER, which stands for technique, which is the literary technique or convention that Bradbury uses, provide evidence, so direct quotes that are embedded in your response, and of course stating how the reader is meant to think or feel in relation to the theme. Where required, you're asked to use comparative connectives to draw similarity or difference if there's multiple examples. Please ensure that you address both technique, evidence, and discuss the reader response in all of your questions. The suggested approach is outlined here and available on the Word document. In short, you're to think about the techniques that are being used, consider the question, and as already stated, respond to them using TER statements. Let's begin. Extract Part 1, The Hearth and the Salamander. So this is taken from the start of the novel. The context of this passage is that it's the very first passage in Part 1, and it helps to introduce or rather characterize both direct and indirect to the reader as to the main protagonist Guy Montag and his life as a fireman. This passage will be read over 2 slides. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with the great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stowed head, and his eyes all orange flame with the thought of what came next, he flicked the igniter and the hose jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace, while the flapping pigeon-wing books died on the porch and lawn of the house. While the books went up in the sparkling whirls and blew away under wind turned black with burning. Montag grinned, the fierce grin of all men singed and driven back by flame. He knew that when he returned to the firehouse he might wink at himself, a minstrel man, burnt corked in the mirror. Later, going to sleep, he would feel the fiery smile still gripped by his face muscles in the dark. It never went away, that smile. It never ever went away as long as he remembered. So that's the passage. The first question is asking us to consider characterization. A reminder is that you actually have a video that goes in a little bit deeper about characterization and language and imagery that you might like to look at first. But at a basis, please remember your use of POPSMAS and characterization. Let's just reread that opening extract that this first question we can draw answers from. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. With the brass nozzle in his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor, playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. Let's see what the question has to ask. Question. What does the opening description during a routine burn reveal about Guy Montag's feelings towards his job? Specifically, how does it suggest the violence and power a firefighter has in Fahrenheit 451? Within your answer, please reference how Bradbury uses at least 2 of the following techniques: repetition, metaphor, and alliteration. So the question is asking us to find evidence for the reader to understand how Guy Montag feels as a firefighter. We also need to find these questions, or rather answers, and think about the techniques such as repetition, metaphor, and alliteration. Remember that characterization is how a character speaks, with the language they use, their actions and behaviors, even their appearance, and of course their relationship with other characters and what other characters say about them. So, here's the extract again. Let's consider this. Is Montag feeling enjoyment, excitement? Does he feel empowered as he sets alight a house? Or is he fearful and scared? I'll leave that up to you to think as we move on to the next slide. We can also remember that if we're looking for techniques and the suggestion is to consider a metaphor, something is something else. So where might a metaphor appear where an object is being described as something else directly? We have repetition where the same idea is repeated either through a repeated image or even word. Okay, and of course we also have, so it was repetition, metaphor, and I think it was alliteration. Let's have a look. Alliteration. Alliteration being the same letter, so back to back, so where words begin with the same sound. It was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure. So consider that. What technique is being used there where a word might be repeated? To see things eaten, to see things blackened and changed. So also consider, what do they mean by the description of things being eaten? Are we talking about the books and the house being consumed by what? The fire? With the brass nozzle in his fist, with the great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world. So here we have a description of Montag's hose, but it isn't being called a fire hose. What is it being called, and what does that image maybe suggest about the power and predatory nature of Montag as a fireman? It's venomous kerosene upon the world. The blood pounded in his head, and his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor. Now, if blood is pounding in his head, it probably suggests that he's very excited or very focused and eager. We then have a direct comparison to Montag being compared to some amazing conductor playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning. Think about what technique blazing and burning uses to bring down the tatters and charcoal ruins of history. So also consider, why is Ray Bradbury comparing Montag to a conductor, someone who controls or orchestrates? Now we need to write a color-coded response. Please look at an example on the next slide with relationship to this question. A suggested answer might be, Bradbury's opening characterization of Guy Montag suggests to the reader the character's sense of power and enjoyment at burning books and houses as a fireman. This is shown through the repetition of pleasure within the opening two statements. The author further implies Montag's aggression and enjoyment over seeing things eaten to the reader through personifying the fire, but metaphorically calling his fire hose a great python that spits venomous kerosene upon the world. This helps to suggest that Montag, as a fireman, is a predator who has complete control and power. You'll note that not every example is referenced, but at least 3 are, to show the student's understanding of the question, but also the techniques that Bradbury has used. If we look at this through color coding, we can see that the blue words or techniques are highlighted. So the student mentions characterization, repetition, personifying or personification, and metaphor. Furthermore, we actually have references to evidence being quoted, such as pleasure, things eaten, great python, venomous kerosene upon the world. We then also have the acknowledgement of the effect that this is meant to have on the reader by saying, suggests to the reader, this helps to suggest. When writing terse sentences, it is important to note that you should try to write in literary present tense. This means that when you write your responses, you write Bradbury uses, not Bradbury used, or Montag discovers, not Montag discovered, or rather Bradbury begins, not Bradbury began, or this means, not this meant. This is why we still ask for you to submit a draft so your teacher can provide feedback not only about your examples, but also your tense. Let's look at another question, which has a technique focus of symbolism. With his symbolic helmet numbered 451 on his stolid head and his eyes all orange flame with the thought of what came next, he flicked the igniter and the house jumped up in a gorging fire that burned the evening sky red and yellow and black. He strode in a swarm of fireflies. He wanted above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace, while the flapping pigeon-wing books died on the porch and lawn of the house, while the books went up in sparkling wells and blew away on a wind turned dark with burning. Montag grinned the fierce grin of all men singed and driven back by flame. Let's look at this question. The question asks, what symbolic description further characterizes Guy Montag and his fellow firefighters as a collective group who can form and enjoy their job? What this question is asking is, where are there examples of imagery that suggests that Guy Montag is not alone or working in a group? As firemen, they feel empowered because they're all together and they're not alone. Within your answer, please reference how Bradbury uses the following techniques, either metaphor, alliteration, or even a symbolic reference to animals or insects. We are reminded of the techniques that you might like to look at and consider. And here is the extract once again. Now, if we think about this extract, we can read through it and see the following. That there is a reference to Guy Montag striding in a swarm of fireflies, meaning that there are many of them, feeling that he is surrounded and empowered to set alight. He wanted above all, like the old joke, to shove a marshmallow on a stick in the furnace. This suggests that he's having fun. While the flapping pigeon-wing books died on the porch and lawn of the house. Somewhat a bit of an image there to suggest the innocence of the books being burned and dying like a peaceful dove. But we also have the description of, while the books went up in the sparkling wells and blew away on a wind turned dark with burning. I quite like how this passage ends with another collective idea of Montag grinned the fierce grin, suggesting that he feels empowered, of all men, not just one man, but all men, the firemen, singed and driven back by flame. So there's another suggestion as to a potential answer in your response. What does that last line suggest about Montag and his fellow firemen? This is the time for you to take some notes and write a detailed piece of feedback or answer. The next bit of context or extract is taken from part 1, and it's the conversations between Guy Montag and Clarice McKellen. The conversations are meant to help suggest to the reader how Clarice influences Guy to go from being a conformist to somewhat an individual who would challenge the system. The passage is read over 2 slides. Guy Montag says, "You think too many things," said Montag uneasily. Clarice McKellen then says, "I rarely watch the parlour walls or go to races or fun parks, so I've got lots of time for crazy thoughts, I guess." Later on, in another discussion, she mentions that the psychiatrist wants to know why I go out and hike around in the forest and watch the birds and collect butterflies. "I'll show you my collection someday," with Guy Montag responding, "Good." Clarice McKellen goes on to say, "They want to know what I do with all my time. I tell them that sometimes I just sit and think, but I won't tell them what. I've got them running. And sometimes I tell them I like to put my head back like this and let the rain fall into my mouth. It tastes just like wine. Have you ever tried it?" "No, Clarice says, "You have forgiven me, haven't you?" Guy Montag then goes on to say, "Yes." He thought about it. "Yes, I have. God knows why. You're peculiar. You're aggravating, yet you're easy to forgive. You say you're 17. Now later on in the novel, when Guy's by himself, the narrator describes that Clarice runs off, and she ran off and left him standing there in the rain. Only after a long time did he move, and then, very slowly, as he walked, he tilted his head back in the rain, just for a few moments, and opened his mouth. Now here we have the quotes again, with a technique focus of characterization and dialogue. And let's think about this. The question asks, how does the above conversation between Guy Montag and Clarice McKellen characterize Clarice McKellen as different compared to everyone else in Fahrenheit 451? Within your answer, please reference how Ray Bradbury uses both Guy Montag and Clarice McKellen's dialogue to characterize her as an individual. Let's remind ourselves that characterization does relate to what characters say, but also how they say it. We can also consider pop smarts, but at a basis, let's think about their dialogue. And if we look at this, what does Guy Montag say to suggest that independent thought or individual thought is different to what everyone is doing? You think too many things, which he feels uneasy about. Clarice then responds, "I rarely watch the parlour walls, as we know are the big projection of TVs in everyone's room, or go to races where people speed recklessly, or go to fun parks where it's dangerous. So I've got lots of time for crazy thoughts, I guess." So what does her statement about thoughts being crazy suggest? How does it make her an individual? Later on, she explains that she's seeing a psychiatrist simply because she likes to hike and explore the forest. She is a naturalist. She enjoys nature, which is uncommon or seen as being weird in this future world. You might like to think about what example she mentions of doing so and what Guy Montag says about it. Now's a chance for you to write a response in relation to that question. So now we have a question focusing on characterization, dialogue, and character action. And once again, we have the same excerpt that we're going to try and answer a different question with. Let's see what the question says. The question asks, during one of their conversation, Clarice Mackellar reveals that she likes to let the rain fall and taste it before Guy Montag makes a comment. How does the author use emotive language within Guy Montag's response and later description from the narrator to suggest Claire's influence over Guy? If we look at the extract, we can see the following. The Guy says, yes, he thought. Yes, I have. God knows why. You're peculiar. You're aggravating, yet you're easy to forgive. Think about what those words mean about their relationship and how it might help answer the question. Now is your chance to write a response. Here's another question that asks you to consider characterization, symbolism, and contrast. This one doesn't require an extract because it's drawing upon your knowledge of both the first extract and the conversations between Guy and Clarice. The question asks you to consider the following. Throughout the novel, before Clarice's death, there are numerous references to enjoying rain. Specifically, Ray Bradbury has Clarice enjoy walking and tasting the rain, only then to have Guy tilt his own head back just for a few moments and taste the rain when no one is looking. Drawing upon the initial character description of Guy Montag, initially enjoying fire and the burning and the blazing of it and its ability to destroy, state why you think Bradbury has Clarice enjoy the rain. What is the intention of this contrast of imagery, which means difference? And how does it help characterize them as either conforming to the laws in society of book burning and well-being of firemen, or ideally challenging them? For this, you might like to consider the opposites of rain and fire and what they might symbolically represent. Remember, a symbolism can be more than their literal self, so think about what water or rain might represent, as opposed to fire being destruction. You now have an opportunity to write a response. Once you've written all your responses, please remember to submit by the draft date so you can receive further feedback. Thank you.